Computer-generated chess problem 2746 by Chestatica. White is ahead in material, obviously, but his rook on a6 is threatened by the king, so is the bishop on c2, not to mention the pawn on b4. So it would seem like the obvious thing to do here would be maybe queen to f1 check. This attacks the king and simultaneously X-ray defends the rook on a6. Black might try rook to c4, cross check, intervenes between the king and queen whilst simultaneously giving check to the white king. King to d5, so king captures rook. There's no hurry to capture the black rook because it is pinned, so king to c6. If b5, queen to a1 mates, so pawn captures pawn, and now queen captures rook with check. King to a7, queen to f7 check, king to a6, queen to a2 mate. A mate in 6, it would seem. But what if I told you that there's an even better way to win? A faster way. Let's take a look. So forget the rook on a6. Give check to the king, but on d7. Now first things first, if king captures pawn, rook to a4 mates, okay, the a4 square is double defended by the queen and the bishop, or even queen to a4 mates. The rook on c3 blocks the king's flight square. So king captures pawn is out of the question. What about king to c4? Well then, the queen moves back to e6. And here, if the king moves back to its original square on b5, rook captures b6 with mate, now that the queen defends the rook, and the rook X-ray defends the pawn on b4. Notice how the pawn on c5 blocks the king's flight square. The square on a5 is guarded by the pawn on b4, and the a4 square is guarded by the bishop on c2. All the pieces seem to be playing a role. But what about the obvious thing, which is king captures the quote-unquote free rook? Well, the pawn comes into action. b5, check. The king only has one square, which is to a5. This is followed by queen to a7 check. If king to b4, queen to a4 mates, again the rook on c3 blocks its own king. And if king captures pawn, queen to a4 also mates. Notice how the pawns on b6 and c5 block the king's flight squares. Looking back at the original position, white actually gives up a full rook and pawn for a very efficient mate that takes advantage of where black's pieces happen to be. Kind of uses black's pieces against him. I hope you enjoyed this one. I sure did.
Chestetica's Book of Chess Constructs, Volumes 1 through 5. Available on Amazon.